protect the townspeople and save as many people as possible. When they heard their commander's orders, they began to fight. But the demon was still in the same place. She didn't like the fact that the ants had gotten into the tree. And no matter how hard they tried, everyone would die here today. And as soon as it started to attack, Luton felt first its immense power, and even with the divine power of Hercules, he realized that he couldn't handle it. But the girl behind him started shouting to Luton to be careful, because she was already at his back. But he managed to bounce back a little, but the girl yelled again that she was coming up behind him. But at that moment, Sun An appeared and started using his demonic execution skill. And then he went down to the Luton and started to take him by the shoulder to teleport him to another place. And once they were in the other place, he started apologizing for being a little late. But the fact that there's another new devil means it's gonna be a tough fight. But the problem is, he doesn't know what skills she's gonna have. But Luton suddenly told him to be careful with her sword, and even his divine personality couldn't resist it. But he pulled out his bone blade and said he'd already killed one demon, so he could handle the second one. The demon standing in front of him with his eyes closed started to say he couldn't see his face, but his energy was specific, and like a drop in a pool, very warm. But Sun An moved behind her back and said he had no warm feelings for them devils. And as soon as he wanted to attack her, she attacked back even though she didn't see anything. And Sun An couldn't understand how she reacted so quickly. The guys watching from the side started asking him how he was feeling. But he couldn't realize that it was Zato who had just pulled out 1,000 daggers in an instant. But the demon raised her sword to the mountain and said that no matter how hard they tried today, they would die, because she could turn them to dust in an instant. But just as she began to attack, a Luton appeared in front of our hero, and with his Hercules power he began to increase his strength 960 times. But that wasn't enough. I started to increase my strength by 1,220 times. And while he was holding back, the devil started yelling at the guys to retreat. But he didn't have to hold back for long, because in an instant he just fell to the ground. And as the girl started to lift him up to bring him to his senses, Sun An started to draw his bone blade. But he realized that if he tried to fight her back now, he'd die in the same place. And as the Luton lost consciousness, he realized that he definitely noticed that every blow from that devil was taking a toll on his mind.
And at that moment the devil's fog began to clear and her vision began to recover.
But our hero realized that before that it was the spirit strike that had allowed him to deal with that devil. But if the enemy has a similar ability, there's nothing you can do. The devil standing opposite our hero began to say that finally she could see him clearly. To which he jokingly replied that he was worried because his warmth charmed her. But she replied in a rude tone that no, he was not the right man, for he had just the same energy, and raised his blade as he began to summon a tremendous energy and activate his 3,000 moment skill. And as the huge wave hit Sun Anu, he refused to resist at that moment, because such an opponent seems capable of destroying the world with every blow, and maybe she's right. No matter how hard he tries, he'll die. And whether people would be destroyed by demons in the end, he didn't fully understand, and he didn't know if there was any hope in the world. A little while later, Luton began to calm down, because he saw Sun An come to his senses, not realizing where he was. And he began to explain to Sun An that they had escaped from the city of Manches. Although they had suffered minimal casualties and most of them had managed to stay alive. And Luton also added that he had been unconscious for 2 days. Sun An could not understand why it had taken so long. And perhaps the eternal crown had kept him from the death blow, but the mental attack had robbed him of his senses. And yet he couldn't understand how they had managed to escape from the devil's grasp. Luton slowly began to answer him that it was thanks to Hussein, and he had sacrificed himself to save them, For when he stood before the devil, she said only that he had not long to live, and he said it wasn't worth it to keep them all. But the devil said why should he suffer such agony, and she would ask Battus to turn him into a henchman. But Hussein shouted for her to shut her mouth, and as long as his arena and combat powers are in effect, she won't escape his control, and until her last breath he won't let her go after his kin. And he is Hussein, commander of the Order of the Golden, that of the Knights of the City of Manchester. His abilities were created for fighting, but the devil replied that he's just a man without food and VD with severe wounds. He won't last long, and she can already feel the effect of the gradual collapse. With his last breaths he shouted that it was enough for him to let his people escape to fulfill his duty as a knight. And the rest is up to them. He always believed that they would find a way to deal with them. The people will defeat the demons. And a little while later in the neighborhood, and the many people who had escaped from the city continued on their way. Luton began to say that they'd been walking for 3 days without sleep or rest, and they were exhausted, and that they should stop and rest soon to regain their strength to keep going. But Sun An forbade them to do so, for the demons could overtake them at any moment, and until they reached the city they must not stop for a minute. It was hard for the girl to hear, for she didn't understand why they had to go and if they were going to where Jeju's main army was. But Sun An, looking at the mountains, told them that they had not long to go and that as soon as they crossed the Sunset Mountains they would finally reach the place. At this time in town, one of the guys started coming to Zai Jun's house and asking her to have a drink with him. But she wasn't alone, and Feng, who was sitting next to Zai Jun, started yelling at him that he was crazy and didn't know the rules of decorum and that he should knock before entering the girl's room. But he kept laughing and asking why they were having a party and he wasn't invited. To which Zai Jun told him that girls like to gossip together, but as soon as he heard the word gossip, he started to ask what and who he wanted to hear about. Everybody likes to gossip. But his partner suddenly got up from her seat and put her hand on his shoulder and told him to get out of here. And with a flick of her hand she threw him out the window. Zai Jun then started laughing and told Nana that if she really liked Bai Mu, she should tell him because she had actually noticed that they were attracted to each other in the guild. But Nana just blushed when she heard that and said that whoever likes him is just calling her a redhead. But Zai Jun added that if you like someone, you have to be brave enough to confess. Otherwise, how can he know how she feels, and secret crushes are the most useless thing. But Nana suddenly turned the tables and started asking Zai Jun what about her. Because she had noticed in the guild that she cared about Sun Anya all the time and she wouldn't deny that she had feelings for him. And she realized that they have mutual love. He has a look on his face that says he feels it, even though she does too. But at that moment Zai Jun started waving her arms around saying, "It's not true. She just doesn't like that he's always alone. And it's very sad." And Nana realized that it's true that the guild is full of single bachelors, and why doesn't she care for them so much? But suddenly Bai Mu burst through the door again. And the girls saw him and started asking why he was back again and why he shouldn't eavesdrop on their conversations. But he just had something important to say, and it's about Sun An. They have to listen to him to understand what it's about. Because he's right outside the main gate, and he's brought a bunch of people with him. And he was standing at the main gate, and he started to tell the guards that his name was Sun An, and he had 30,000 people with him, and they should open the gate. And at that moment the head of Liu Shu came to the gate and began to tell the guards not to let them out, because of course Sun An would be able to get into the city. Lu Tong, who was standing next to Sun An, didn't understand what was going on and why they wouldn't let them in. But the head of Liu Shu began to explain that his mission was to gather information about the demon invasion in the K area, not to show his bravery by saving people. But Sun An began to explain that the situation was more complicated than she could imagine, and the demons could attack at any moment, and she should open the gate and post, and they would talk. But she just smirked and said that now she is in charge of the defense of this city, so it's up to her to decide who gets in and who doesn't. And then Zai Jun started running up to the gate to make sure it was really him, because she'd just heard his voice. And once they got upstairs, they were glad he was back and started asking him if he knew anything about the demon invasion, but they also didn't understand why they weren't being let in. And the head of Liu Shu started to answer that it was because it was up to her, not them. That made Feng angry and she started calling her a weasel. But Nana also added that the head of Liu Shu, just because Jeju isn't here doesn't mean she can do whatever she wants, and Sun An is not only the head of Guild Zero but also a friend of her strategic group. Outside, Sun An started asking the girls if Jeju was around, to which Nana replied that he's been reclusive since he left. He's at the Hadaimon Royal Palace. Logically, the Holy Sword Improvement Ceremony should have been completed by now, and they don't know what he's doing now. The head of Liu Shu will also add that this is the way things are and Jeju isn't here. Only she can raise the Hademon's banner, and he can only get in if he leaves those people behind. Feng, standing beside her, couldn't understand what she was saying and why she wouldn't let the civilians go. But the head of Liu Shu turned his head and said that they naive girls don't understand that they are in a war for survival, and the worst part is that they have no idea how long it will last. The city they're in is very large, but its resources are limited and everyone needs to eat. So the more of them